Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Patrice Sulton. Patrice is the founder of the DC Justice Lab, and she's a 2022 Echoing Green Global Fellow. Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I should mention you're an attorney and a professor and a criminal justice reform advocate based in Washington, D.C.
That's correct.
So tell us a little bit about the DC Justice Lab.
DC Justice Lab is getting ready to celebrate its 5th anniversary. We launched shortly after George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis when a group of my law students wanted to do something meaningful about policing in the District of Columbia. And they rolled up their sleeves for a summer and were tasked with not only trying to write better laws, but writing laws informed by people who had experienced those tactics firsthand. And since then, it's grown into an organization that is tackling the entire criminal legal system in Washington, D.C. as it exists today, and trying to build solutions that actually keep people safer, freer, and more equal. And we've been able to work on policy changes ranging from policing to the conditions of confinement in our local jails to criminal record sealing and expungement to everything in between. And we still have quite a connection to young movement lawyers through our fellowship program. So it operates a lot like it did in those early days to some extent.
Well, it's interesting because we're celebrating the 5th anniversary. I don't know if we want to call it an anniversary or celebrating. Mourning maybe is more like it, of George Floyd's death. The other interesting thing is yesterday I got an interesting press release about the Washington, D.C. jail, and I understand it's an atrocity, and folks are looking for a new one, although in a lot of places, they don't even want new jails. So I'd be interested in your take on kind of that.
It is a fascinating dilemma for the movement right now. I never would have imagined a year like 2020 where people started talking in serious terms about what abolition and defunding could look like in practice. And as you've noted, in a lot of jurisdictions, people have committed to saying no new jails. We're not going to build these facilities for them to be filled. We're going to put an end to the profiteering. In DC, we are uniquely treated differently, not having any statehood. And so everyone who is convicted of an offense under our local laws, who is sentenced to more than a year of incarceration, is sent into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons and sent wherever BOP wants to send them around the country. They're moved around all the time. So it isn't as if your family could move close to where you are. And so the dilemma that it presents is the clear call to action from people who are actually incarcerated for DC offenses is to build something closer to home, not just something that's more humane and more livable, but something that's near to the family and community that they know best, which is really very much at odds with this no new jails movement that we're seeing in other places. So it's something that I like to pose as a question for our fellows as they think about what it means to be a movement lawyer and to listen to folks who are just as impacted and to really understand the difference between working in someone's express interest versus their best interest in your opinion. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's been an interesting thing to watch from this very unique vantage point as a district.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought of that issue, even though a long time ago I actually lived in DC for a couple of years. But um, you know, the fact that DC doesn't have statehood makes it more tricky. And there are all sorts of studies out there that show that proximity to family and support networks is critical for people that are incarcerated.
Absolutely. And, it's uniquely difficult here as well because even our local jail has had unusually restrictive visitation the entire time I've been practicing law. So for decades, people have not been able to have any like real face-to-face contact with their loved ones while they're at the jail. And for a long period of time, even the sort of visitation through the glass was very hard to schedule or very rare to occur. So, when people are removed from our community, it's a special form of exile in DC.
So when I lived in DC back in the 90s, you know, I would hear gunshots at night within, sound range at least of where I lived in Southwest, a couple of blocks from the Capitol. How are things changed over the last almost 30 years now?
Think the biggest difference that you would notice from that vantage point is that when bullets here and elsewhere used to sound like a pop, a pop, a pop with seconds in between, now it sounds like spraying bullets. Now, these weapons that can fire in rapid succession, many, many rounds, are almost ubiquitous in our cities. And unlike other places, none of those weapons actually are manufactured or sold in the District of Columbia. They're all coming in from out of state. But we see quite a bit, an intolerable amount, in fact, of gun violence in our city. And despite, having commissioned a number of recommendations for how to reduce gun violence, the city has been pretty slow to implement those recommendations, unlike the cities that have seen a faster reduction in gun violence over the last 5 years.
And is that because DC is a federal town, or is it just the quirks of local governance?
It's a little bit of both. So, with respect to us being this federal enclave or district, as we're described, there are public safety measures that we know were calculated to reduce crime or to reduce recidivism that were not allowed to take root because of congressional interference. But there's also a reluctance from our local executive branch to implement some of the recommendations that have been made. And I think national politics and optics play an important role in what people here are willing to do and not do as decision makers. There isn't as much of a reflexive um, kind of, I guess, catering to the voters that live here. There's always this secondary consideration of what will people outside the district say? What will this mean for this party or that party more generally in national politics? And that makes it very hard to move quickly on things that we know are proven to work well.
And I should mention that you're kind of a policy advocate on risk-based firearm. Maybe you can explain what that is.
Sure. So, you know, we believe strongly that the best policies are not just community rooted, but also based in evidence. And when it comes to gun violence prevention, a lot of times policy is driven by things that are not really indicators of future potential for gun violence. They're driven by things like prior conviction record, which sometimes is a reflection of racist enforcement of our laws, sometimes a reflection of our laws not being written very well, and oftentimes under-inclusive of those things that we know are indicators that someone shouldn't have a gun. A couple of examples of that I like to highlight are, if we have bodies of evidence that show that irresponsible use of alcohol or that domestic violence are really good indicators that someone should not have a firearm. If we're looking only at conviction records to see who's been using alcohol irresponsibly or who's been engaging in domestic violence, not only are we going to be over-inclusive of some folks who might not actually be a real danger to themselves or others, but we're missing entire swaths of people who maybe have engaged in activity that's led to a car crash or an injury or another body of data outside of our criminal legal system that gives us real insight into who should be disarmed. So I like to tell people that the idea is to focus on risk, not race, and to really try to get to the root cause of violence and to focus on prevention as opposed to punishment after the fact.
And, one of the interesting things that I've seen is this interesting kind of dichotomy between protecting the public from firearms and then these kind of heavily incarceral laws that are designed to punish people for the misuse of firearms. And so it really is an interesting, kind of split, right?
It is. And what I've noticed is that there's an overemphasis on collecting firearms as if that prevents violence from occurring. And that's why I think data transparency has taken center stage in how I think about policy reform at times in ways that it didn't before. If someone is posting on a police department's Twitter page, look how many guns we collected this year, and that number is somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000. If you think we only have 5,000 guns in the city, that's a pretty impressive number. If you think we have 400 or 500,000 guns in the city, you might say, hey, actually, maybe we should be using those resources to prevent people from pulling the trigger. And so, that's the kind of redirection of attention that I think has been an important aspect of the advocacy work that we do. It's the public education about what's the environment in which these numbers are being shared with the public and what do we know will actually work better, either from times in the past or from jurisdictions outside of DC, or even sometimes looking globally at what's worked in places that don't have as many firearms as we do.
And moving toward the issue of prosecutorial accountability, I mean, it really is kind of interesting watching kind of all the all the various aspects of this that are now playing out because for a long time it was, oh, okay, it's time to get some more progressive prosecutors in and try to reform the system. And now you got this weird mix, right, of like traditional law enforcement, and then you have Larry Krasner able to somehow win re-election again in Philadelphia, but then you have kind of this crazy Trumpism that's infecting prosecutors. And I don't know if you've seen enough to be able to kind of comment on this, but I'm interested, since you're in DC, of your take on all of this.
I have strong opinions about who is selected to serve as the U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia and elsewhere. And I don't know if before this year, nearly as many people realized that we don't get to elect our own top prosecutor here, that that's a person selected by the President of the United States. Nor do I think people recognized what that means in practice and how much decision-making authority the Attorney General for the United States and the U.S. Attorney that sits in each federal court around the country have on the everyday lives of the people who live there. This was really remarkable to see not just some outlandish things happening with respect to the charging decisions and pardons and leniency that were exercised, but the language that was being used that was dehumanizing toward people who live in our city, calling people thugs, for example, the stance that was taken on not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also the oath that is sworn to uphold the Constitution when, this prosecutor sent a letter to Georgetown Law School saying they wouldn't hire anyone from there. So it was really alarming. And what it meant for me is that as a profession, we have a real responsibility to take a close look at the ethics rules that we use to govern ourselves. And although there are these other sort of practice standards that don't bind us, they're good guidance for thinking about what our ethics rules actually should include to make sure that prosecutors are exercising that tremendous authority responsibly, fairly, and in ways that keep us safe.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, and maybe interesting isn't the right word, but I'll use it. Is that for most of my time in this profession, last 15 years or so, it's been about criminal justice reform. It's been about, rights under the law and things like that. And now we get these stories, and I just pulled this one up yesterday. A federal judge tore into Trump's interim U.S. attorney for New Jersey for abusing her office as a weapon against the administration's political enemies. So this is now starting to sound like something out of Russia rather than the U.S.
I call it the war on cities. And I'm hoping that people pay attention to what it means for our democracy when we see legislative bodies not allowed to do their jobs, prosecutors not allowed to do their jobs, and cities not allowed to, really exercise the self-determination that they're entitled to exercise, particularly in cases where we're talking about safety and health and the well-being of majority and plurality Black cities in our country. So as disheartening and disappointing as it was to see the congressional interference that happened here as part of a larger pattern of that kind of disenfranchisement, I also recognize that patterns can be powerful, and I'm hopeful that people will understand what it really means to attack democracy from that angle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even under my worst case scenario, this is worse than that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, there are things to be hopeful about when people start to recognize these connections. I think even just looking at our city, when home rule is under attack, people are locking arms across issue areas, across wards in ways that they didn't before. And I hate that it is happening this way, but I'm glad that it's happening no less. And I hope that nationally we see the same kinds of galvanizing moments resulting from either actual attacks or the threat of an attack. When I look at my home state of Wisconsin, I found it really interesting that so many people took an interest in a local election of a judge there. And it was because I think at least it was because people recognized that this is an attack on our democratic process that doesn't end in Wisconsin. It's part of this more principled, I guess, debate that we're having now, though it shouldn't be a debate at all, around who is allowed to control the affairs that affect them and their families the most.
Yeah, and I mean that's an interesting aspect. And we saw this happen, during the first Trump administration, and it kind of culminated in the George Floyd movement.
Mm.
And what was interesting about that was that all of a sudden, I would cover things locally, and I'd see people showing up at Black Lives Matter that probably never even thought about police violence in their lives before. And I'm like, wow, you're here. And it's crazy. But and it's also crazy how quickly that was fell by the wayside and things kind of reversed themselves.
Movements are cyclical and the backlash was to be expected, but I'm with you that it stands out to me when people who I don't always see interested and involved or vocal or public in their opinions really standing up in new ways. It stands out to me. And even in recent months, friends I have who are attorneys completely disinterested in policy reform or criminal law or the things that I do, I noticed we're posting quite a bit about the rule of law and the idea that a court order wouldn't mean anything in practice is really unsettling to many people who practice law. And so I try to take note of those things as I see them. Like, oh, here's somebody that doesn't always speak out about these things, who's that taken aback that they felt they needed to voice something here. And I think what's happening in 2025 is as powerful as what we saw 5 years ago. The question is, will we make the most of that opportunity to move things in the direction we know we deserve?
So do you come down as an optimist or a pessimist?
I don't think you can do movement work as a pessimist. I mean, you know, I hold on to a great deal of hope. And, I tell our fellows and my students that the things that have transpired in the 20 years since I was a student are remarkable in both directions. I mean, I absolutely never would have thought that I would see a Muslim ban, but I absolutely never thought that I would see a black president or a black Supreme Court just a black woman Supreme Court justice either. And I never thought I would hear people talking about defund in serious terms. So being ready and committed to that fight, I think, is the important part. And sometimes I take note that folks who are on the other side of a lot of the issues that I'm advocating for do a much more diligent job of tilling the soil in the years that they're not in power, of playing the long game, and of committing to the strategies we know moved civil rights work forward in decades and generations past. So I hope that I will build that patience and attention and long-term optimism instead of having to kind of renew it as often as I can through the work that I'm doing with these new lawyers.
Yeah, but one thing that's disconcerting for me is that it felt like for a while people were open to this notion of alternatives to incarceration and maybe throwing somebody in a cage and throwing away the key wasn't exactly the best way to approach things. And I feel like, and I'm in liberal California, and I've seen kind of this sea change in the other direction in the last 4 or 5 years. Whereas we had made a lot of progress, probably from 2010 to 2020. And, I can't help but be pessimistic.
Well, here's where you might be able to fairly relabel me a pessimist. When I look at the waves of progress and backlash, particularly in California, it reminds me that I really do believe that people move in their own self-interest in a lot of ways when it comes to public safety. And although we'd like to think we're just appealing to the better side of everyone's humanity, you can see that when the the language is just out there on the table, black and white, people are not really interested in other people's dignity and well-being as much as they are in reducing crime and reducing cost and making sure there aren't errors in our procedures. And, I've really found so many lenses compelling for the reasons that we shouldn't overpunish. We don't want to punish people who might be factually innocent. We don't want to take victims' voices out of the equation. We don't want to have so much profiteering involved in our legal system. But what I've always found most compelling is the fact that the way we're going about policing, prosecuting, and imprisoning people in this country is making crime worse. And if more people understood that safer communities stem from us addressing all of these root causes, and that our approach to punishment right now is itself a root cause, I think people would be moved to do the right thing more than just trying to appeal to this is your fellow man, your fellow woman. Please, treat them as you would treat yourself or your family member. I just don't find in the polling that that's what's swaying people most often on the issues that I care about most. And it saddens me, but I still think there's a strategy there, and I think it's valid.
Yeah, and to dig a little deeper into this, I mean, one of the things that that we know from the research is that the way the system is set up, it sets up people to fail. And all we have to do is look at a really simple thing. 85% of people that are incarcerated will one day be released. Now, wouldn't we want them to like be able to get jobs and education and things that we know reduce the chances of them recidivating? And yet we make it impossible. It's hard to get college loans when you have a record. It's hard to get kind of housing when you have a record, public housing. It's hard to get jobs in a lot of states, and even in places where they've banned the box, right? People can still easily access people's records. And so if you want to make it impossible for somebody to get on the straight and narrow, you couldn't design a system better than we have. And, one of the cool things that I've gotten to do is work with incarcerated people, teach them journalism, help them get education in prison. And those people don't go out and commit new crimes. Gee, wonder why that is.
Yeah, I've noticed the same trends when I spent, many years representing people in criminal cases and juvenile delinquency cases. For adults in particular, if I were to look at someone's history of system involvement and identify the period of time that was the longest period between contacts, that could be 2 years, it could be 2 weeks, and ask the person, what were you doing? What was going right in your life during this time? It was almost always the same answer. And it was almost always that they had a living wage, that they had a way to provide for themselves, for their family, for them to feel safe, for them to feel whole. And, sometimes I have to remind myself that as complicated and in the weeds as I might get in trying to craft a policy correctly, at the end of the day, what we're talking about really isn't rocket science. And in DC, the contrast is so clear and obvious because we have all but abolished police and prisons for white residents of the district, where we rely on them extremely heavily for Black people, particularly those who are Native Washingtonians or who have been there for generations. So it's just so clear when you're in a city that small with that big a contrast that, hey, if we just did the things we're doing over here for everybody else, we'd have safety citywide. And pushing people to do that is the work. And I'm glad to do it.
Yeah. And one thing I remember from when I lived there was how stark that difference was between the people that were the long-term residents of the city versus the people that were part of official Washington. And I was a young intern, right? But you'd walk down the street and you'd see the difference. You'd see the people sitting on the street versus the people walking in suits. Gee, it's staring you right in the face.
It is. And I remember speaking with someone in Atlanta, and they used a phrase, I don't know if they coined it, but they talked about the difference between people who flew there and people who grew there. And that really resonated with me when I think about the two cities we have inside the District of Columbia.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time here. How can people learn more about what you guys are doing? Is there an opportunity for people to get involved? What would that look like?
Absolutely. Please follow us on social media. We're at DC Justice Lab on Instagram, Twitter. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook as well. And we love working with volunteers. We always need more support for our research. So please check out our DC Justice Library on our website and our volunteer interest form if you want to get involved. But I'm most excited for people to see the library, be able to study these criminal justice issues for themselves, see how a bill becomes a law in the district, schoolhouse rock style, and be able to build their own campaigns. And we're here to support you if that's something you want to do.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. We've been talking with Patrice Sulton. She's the founder of the DC Justice Lab. They do a lot of really important work in Washington, DC. And I think, unfortunately, in the next 4 years, the work that you guys are doing is going to become all the more important because you guys really are on the front line of a lot of this stuff.
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed our conversation and appreciate the work you're doing here. Please keep it up.
Thank you. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.